recording now. Cool. But actually, it's not a simple answer, because Jenkins X is many things. It's a CLI which we're going to use during the session. It's also a collection of community tools. So it's using several community tools or open source services and applications. And it's also, we are working. A lot of the principles used in Jenkins X are taken from they're inspired from the Accelerate book, if you heard of it. So it's really quite a lot of things when it comes to Jenkins X. It's not a simple answer to say what it actually is. So today, this session is going to be a partial walkthrough. I want it to be a full walkthrough, but since some of those steps takes quite some time, I prepared them in advance. So there are basically 4 steps. One of them is creating a cluster, which I already did. I've chosen EKS to use for today's session, but Jenkins X supports several other cloud providers. I think officially it's just EKS and Google Cloud. But they have providers for other Kubernetes providers. And then basically the next step would be to install Jenkins X on the cluster. I also did that in advance because it's also a bit time consuming. So today we're going to focus on actually the process of using Jenkins X on building an application. So I'll take a few examples and show you how the flow would be. And just to mention, I will share the slides afterwards. I also prepare like a step-by-step walkthrough for everything that I've done and I will do here. And I will share all of these after this session on the Meetup group. Okay, moving forward. So if you would like to, later on, if you would like to follow along what I'm doing, what I've done and I will be doing here, you need a few things. Well, one of them would be a free GitHub organization with 2 free users, which is something I will use today. Although it's not really necessary to have an organization. You can also just do just fine with 2 users. One user is used for approving PRs, so it's kind of the one of the owners of the real users, real human users, and then the other user is used as a bot user, which Jenkins X will use to do all kind of automated commits and trigger all kind of pipelines. Second thing that would be useful is to have an AWS account to run the EKS cluster in. And third, there are some tools that you would need to install. I prepared a script which is linked as this gist here, which basically installs all of this for you. So as I mentioned, I created a GitHub organization just to be a bit closer on how a real team would work with. Although, well, there's just 2 users. So I called an organization, it's called Jenkins X Play, with the ID Jenkins X-Play. And in this organization, there are 2 users. One of them is the one on the left, Alex Kiri, that's me. And then the Dalek one is the bot user I'm going to use, and that is called Alex Kiri Play. I mentioned this because I will talk about them a little bit later. Now, about the environment. Personally, I will run everything from this walkthrough in a Debian virtual machine running in Windows Subsystem for Linux too. But you can run as fine on any platform. Again, I'm mentioning here the script. You can try and just set up everything that you would need for this and a little bit more. I added some more tools that I found useful to have when running Kubernetes. Okay, the first step. So the first step that I did was to create an EKS cluster using the Jenkins X CLI. So you don't necessarily have to create a cluster using the Jenkins X CLI, but it's the simplest way to do it. Jenkins X has certain requirements on the cluster in order to run. So basically, I found that the easiest way to actually get those right is by using the Jenkins X CLI to create it just in the right way it needs it. The creation takes about 20 minutes. Using this command, you will create an EKS, a Kubernetes cluster in EKS with 2 nodes. I put here a minimum of 2 and a max of 4, but in my test, I didn't need more than this. So for this walkthrough, actually, I never used more than the 2 nodes. Okay, and the next step is actually installing Jenkins X on the cluster. I already did this as well. Jenkins X provides a special repository that you can clone, and then you can use it to deploy Jenkins X on the cluster. It's basically, it has all kind of presets that are already done in there. And then you just have to customize like a few things, like for example, telling Jenkins X that you want to run on EKS. I locked the version of Jenkins X to a certain version. I've seen some issues in the latest one, so I just locked it to the last one that I know it's working for this demo. And then you can, one of the things that I'm putting here is also mentioning that I want the repositories used for the different environments that are going to be deployed in the cluster for Jenkins X. I mentioned I want these repositories to be public. So if you are using, if you would be using a free GitHub organization, all the repositories need to be public or free. So this is the reason I set this one here. And then you configure these 3 things, and then you run jxboot, and well, this is going to ask a lot of questions. Well, not so many, but quite a few about the different configuration and so on. And then, well, in about 10 maybe minutes, you'll have Jenkins X deployed on the cluster. So the next step, and this is where I would like to do it together with you or show you how to do it, is deploying a simple application on the cluster. So I'll get out of here and open the shell. And please let me know in the chat if anyone has issues seeing the text here. And I will adjust it. So first thing, I wanted to show you how the output looks like when I created the cluster. I lost some part of it here in the shell, but basically you can see how the creations got along. And basically this just created a EKS cluster with 2 nodes. Yeah, you can see actually here the default version of Kubernetes is 1.14 still in EKS. And later on, this is the part where, oh, yes, nice. Yeah, maybe they don't have to be free anymore. Sorry, don't have to be public. Yes, I heard about that. Thank you, Krister. But I didn't really try it out yet. So, so here is like the output where you could see how I clone the environment, the repository here that I mentioned. And then I just customize the file with the 3 things I mentioned, and then I run jxboot from inside the repository. And then there's a lot of different questions around here. I won't go through these. You can find them in the walkthrough I will share with you. I try to explain as much of this step as possible in there. And well, later on, the cluster, the Jenkins X is installed. So installation is currently looking good. Okay, so that being said, I will send all the links a little bit later on. I will also publish them on the Meetup group. So to get started, I opted to use one of the predefined applications. So Jenkins X is providing with a lot of templates, or they call them quick starts. Basically, they're just very basic applications in or services in different languages. So for today, I chose to create and deploy a React.js quick start. And I will do that by using Jenkins X. And why can't I copy? Okay, so in order to create a new project, oh, and actually I need to move out of this folder. I'm still inside of the boot folder. I'll explain a bit more about the environments. I just want to get a bit started this part, and it will make more sense to you a little bit later on what all these folders mean. So yeah, let's create here a quick start. Yes, so first thing that it asked me is, it asked me about basically what username should own this repository. And in this case, I will use my, my real username, so not the bot one, because basically I want it to be the owner of this repository, being my service that I want to develop. And then it asks for an API token. So Jenkins X talks to GitHub using the GitHub API. So in order to do that, it requires a token. The token is very easy to do. I'll document it. I will share it a bit later with you. Now I'll just copy paste it here. And here it's going to ask me who should be the owner of the repository. And I want all of the repositories created for this project to be owned by the organization I just created. So I'll just select that one. It's going to ask me for the new repository name. So I'll just name it Cool React. Now Jenkins X is going to start creating all kinds of things. It's going to create a local repository based on this template or quick start, as they call it. Yes, I would like to initialize Git now. So yeah, it's fine to use that commit message. And it's going to initialize this project locally. And it also is going to try to recognize what kind of language is using this project. So you can see here, it's detected that it's using JavaScript. And based on that, it's going to generate automatically some pipelines for us. We'll see a little bit about that later on. Okay, but I mentioned that I wanted to give you just a few, just some information. So the project has been created. There's a repo, there's a folder here called React that has been created. And it's a very basic React application. We will change it a little bit later. But first thing, I just wanted to give you a very high level, some details about Kubernetes. In this moment, there are some pipelines starting, and it takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to use this time just for a few minutes to give you just a few, just some information about Kubernetes in general. Maybe there are some of you who don't know much about some of the details here. So I have a, quick one here. So, well, basically Kubernetes is an open source system for automating deployment, scaling, and management of containerized applications. This is a lot of, oh, cancel. There are a lot of words here, but what I like to think about Kubernetes is that it's composed out of two components, two major components. And basically all those components are virtual machines. So I like to think about having Kubernetes being composed of master components and also, or VMs, and also workers VMs. And there's an imperfect analogy that I like to use here, that, well, basically the workers can be seen as the brain of our body, and then sorry, the master, you can see them as the brain of our body, and the workers, you can see that the other parts of our body that the brain controls. So the workers are the virtual machines that will actually execute all the services that we will deploy on them. And the way that these services are being deployed and they run inside of the cluster is being controlled by the brain or the master. What I'm saying is a bit imperfect because, the cluster can still work if the brain is down, which is not something that works in real life. So actually, whatever services are deployed on the worker VMs, they continue running until something happens, even if the master is not running anymore. So that is one of the interesting parts of Kubernetes. And if we look at the master, it's being, so like I mentioned, there are VMs, can be 1 or 3 or 5 usually, and they consist of an API, which is basically the way that you can interact with the cluster and also how the components inside of the cluster interact with each other. It's usually through the API. And then the second important component is etcd, which is it's a basically key value database, and it's basically the memory of the cluster. It knows what is deployed where and how and all of those details. Of course, there's some other components in here, but I wanted to mention those two as I found the most important ones to talk about. And then if we look at the workers, again, they're all VMs, and the most, let's say, the unit, the most atomic unit inside of a node, it's called a pod. So when we talk about Kubernetes, usually we talk about pods. And the pods are basically a number of Docker containers. And inside of a Docker container, basically we have our service or our services. So these are kind of the units. And on each node, you have a multiple number of pods running, and each of them can have 1 or more Docker containers. And when we want to deploy something on Kubernetes, we just talk to the API, we send it a few files, usually YAML, and we tell it what it wanted to do. We tell it that we wanted to deploy a service, or basically, well, let's not call it a service, but we wanted to deploy an application which is using a specific Docker image and using a specific version. We want to have 3 instances of that application, and we want to deploy it in a specific namespace. In this case, I call it the cool namespace. We can also decide in the same place, how do we want to expose the service outside of the cluster. And basically, if there are all the resources, if all the required resources are available in the cluster will try to do the best and deploy this application. It will usually try to spread the pods among the nodes. So in case a node goes down, then you can still have different instances running in the cluster, but it all depends on how the resources are available on the different nodes. And then we also talk about namespaces, and namespaces are an abstractization basically, or a way to isolate the pods running into the cluster. So if you remember here, I mentioned I want to deploy my service in the cool namespace, and then Kubernetes will try to deploy the 3 pods that I asked for in the cool namespace in different nodes, if possible. And I give here another example, like a classic namespace in Kubernetes is kubesystem, where all the core Kubernetes pods are running. Namespaces are also a way to isolate the pods between each other, and you can decide, you can give roles, and specific roles can access different namespaces, and they can do specific operations in each namespace. So basically, for example, in a production cluster, let's say you want to give access to the namespace where some services are running to specific teams, and then maybe the administrators of the clusters, they can have access to all the namespaces. And this is done through different settings. I will not go into that. And actually, the namespaces look a bit more like this. So on each node, on each worker node, there are a different number of pods. So here in this image, each rectangle is a pod. The size represents maybe the kind of resources, how much RAM and CPU it asks. And the color is the namespace it is part of. So on each node, they're all combined and sitting along together. Okay, so I hope this makes it a bit clear about Kubernetes. We're going to use some of these parts in the next steps. So I just wanted to have some sort of idea of what it is. Okay, let's see how the deployment is doing. So there are a few things that Jenkins X has instructed us to do, told us here. So there are multiple ways to see the pipelines. There are some pipelines generated. And let me see where that is. So first of all, this is we can have a look at the content of the cluster right now. So I'm going to use kubectl, which is the way to, it's the CLI to interact with a Kubernetes cluster, for whoever's not familiar with this. So we can see right now what kind of namespaces we have in the cluster. So these are the namespaces currently installed in the cluster. There will be a bit more. There's a whole bunch of things in here, but I think the ones that are important are the JX and JX staging namespaces. So there's one thing about Jenkins X that is interesting, is that it automatically out of the box creates for us several environments. Actually three. One of them is the development environment, where all the Jenkins X tooling is living. And this is deployed actually in the JX environment. Sorry, the JX namespace. Then another environment is the staging environment, where basically, well, it's like, it's very much like production, but well, it's basically an environment where we would maybe deploy to do some sort of testing, manual testing, validation, and so on. Yeah, there are different ways to use it. And that is basically deployed in the JX staging namespace. And then there's also the production environment. It hasn't been created yet because we haven't really deployed anything to production. And each of them have a repository. So if I look at now in my Jenkins X Play organization, I can actually see that I have 3 repositories there. One for staging, one for production, and one for dev. The content of the dev repository is exactly what we used and cloned in order to install Jenkins X. So this is the file that I modified in order to tell it that I want to run on EKS, that I want my repositories to be public, that they should be owned by Jenkins X Play. And this file is basically changed by Jenkins X while you use Jenkins X and update it. So whenever you want to make some changes on your dev environment, you'd basically interact with this repository and make changes here. And then they would get applied into the cluster. And then we have the staging and production, and basically here it's going to be all kind of details about what kind of services you want to deploy and what versions you want to deploy for each environment. There's another detail that is interesting, that for staging by default, so whenever you are making a commit on the master repository of on the master branch of your service repository, in our case, the cool React here. So whenever I make any commits on the master branch of the repository of our service, those changes are going to be automatically deployed to staging. So this is called an automatic promotion. So for any changes we are doing to the service, to a service which we have installed on Jenkins X, any changes we do on the master branch for that service, they will be automatically deployed to staging. In order to be deployed to production, we need to take a manual step. And I will show that a little bit later. Okay. While I was telling you about these details, several pipelines have been running, hopefully. And there are multiple ways to actually see what pipelines have been running, but I will show you the visual one. So there is a part of Jenkins X, there is a UI where you can visualize the pipelines. Now, the URL to this UI, it depends on your cluster. So I will try to identify which is the URL for my cluster. And basically, these are all the ingress rules, and ingress rules are the way to tell Kubernetes how to expose towards the outside of the cluster different services. So for example, deck is the UI I just mentioned. So it's a service that is basically showing you the pipelines that are running in Jenkins X. And in order to access it, I need to use this host here. So I'll just do that. I'll open that into the browser. And I'm going to get a login dialog. And when I installed Jenkins X, I also configured username and password. So it's just as you would do on a normal Jenkins. So the user is admin, and this is the password. And if we look at it here, we will see that I had 5 pipelines running here. And I will explain a bit more what these pipelines have been doing. But first, I just want to mention that basically, when it comes to Jenkins X, there are 2 pipelines you need to define for each repo. There is a pipeline that you should define when a commit has been done on a branch, or sorry, a pull request. And then there's a pipeline that you should define when a commit has been done on the master branch. And the pipelines are defined on the Jenkins X YAML file in each repo. So each of these repos we have here, it has a pipeline. And you can see here it has pipelines, and one of them is called pull requests, and the other one is called release. And then, and then underneath there are different things that are being defined. So yeah, that's basically it. So here we have different, we have pipelines that have run for the dev environment, for our the initial version of our service. And as I mentioned, or actually, let me explain it in a different way. Yeah, so as I mentioned, since we have automatic promotion in staging with Jenkins X, we already have this service running in staging. So one way to see the URL is to use Jenkins X, and we can say jx get applications. And this is going to give us, it's going to show us all the applications we have deployed on Jenkins X, using Jenkins X. And so what version they are in each environment, how many pods they have, and also the URL. So if I use this URL and open it in my browser, we will basically see our service. So this is Core React, basically a very basic page showing a spinning Jenkins X head. Okay, so I would like to explain a little bit more what happened here so far. So I'll go back to the presentation, and I have a few diagrams here. So the first thing that happened was that, well, I created a Jenkins, an EKS cluster. I show it here empty, but it's not really empty initially. But the whatever is installed initially is not very relevant for our conversation. So I just left it like this. So this was the first step I did in advance. And then the second step I did was installing Jenkins X into the cluster. And when I did that, several things happened. The JX namespace was created. Inside of the namespace, there were some tools installed. There are a bunch of pods running there, which basically make Jenkins X work as it should. And then 3 repositories have been created in my Jenkins X Play organization. One of them, so each of them, one for each environment. And more than that, a webhook has been configured from each of these repos towards the Jenkins X tools. So this webhook basically notifies the Jenkins X tools running in this cluster whenever any Git event happens in those repos. And the Jenkins X tools can decide afterwards what to do, if they should do anything on those events. And this is part of the whole GitOps concept that I will not go much into detail. But basically the pipelines and everything working in the environments is triggered through Git events. Okay, then the third thing that happened was that we have created a new application using the template or the quick start, or React quick start, I don't remember how it was called. And when that happened, as you mentioned, there were about 5 pipelines that have been running. And I tried to explain a bit here what each of these pipelines have done. So the moment we have created, so one of the things that happened, we created the repo for the cool React service. And the way that Jenkins X basically defines that the cool React service is now running in Jenkins X is to make a pull request inside of the dev repository and add the service as a dependency there. So just tell it, hey, you know, we're gonna have a React service now running in the dev. And then after this is done, it will also promote automatically to staging. And the way it does that is through another pull request, where it says, hey, from now on in staging, we want to have the cool React service running on version 001. So these are basically what the pipelines did in dev and staging. And the pipeline running in cool React, triggered by the cool React initial commit, is basically building the service and pushing its Docker image to a repository. In this case, since we're using EKS, Jenkins X is automatically pushing to ECR. There are other options there, but this is how it usually goes by default. Yeah, so as you see, these are basically the five pipelines that have run so far. And here I represented also the first version of the Docker image that went to ECR. I hope this makes it a bit clearer. And also, like I mentioned in the presentation, there are links to a GitHub gist where I basically described all of the steps, step by step, all of the steps in more detail. So it looks something like this. So all the steps that I run during the installation and all of the steps that I'm basically doing right now, they're described here. So you can do this on your own later on if you want. Okay. So next step, we have so far, so we created the cluster, we have installed Jenkins X, or I did that, and now live we created an app and deployed it into it. We've seen it running in staging already. Next step is to create, let's make a change. So I'll get out the presentation. So let's see what I want to do. I want to edit the main component, and I'm thinking to add the date in the main page, something very simple. So let's see, I'm going to edit the component, app.js, yes. So this is basically the source of the page we have seen, this one here, with the spinning logo and the name, and I want to add today's date here. And then deploy it. Okay, so let's see, welcome to Jenkins. Yeah, let's do this here. I will add today 16 of April 2020. Okay, so very important change. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is that I will create a new branch. I will push this change into that branch and create a pull request, like we would do in any team. So when we try to deploy a new feature, we create a branch. And then we want to create a pull request because we want to make those changes transparent to the rest of the team or the teams. And that is usually a good way to do it. Okay, so I'm going to create a new branch, -b, let's call it small change. And let's see what changed. It should be just one file exactly. So I'll add this to Git, and I'm going to commit add date into the main page. Great, so now I want to push it. Well, push, not. Yeah. So it's the first time I commit to this branch and push this branch. Okay. Oh, yes. Now I probably got a lot of emails. This React project is quite old and it has a lot of vulnerable dependencies. So GitHub is very quick to notify me and send me emails about this. So let's have a look at the repository for React. Yeah, this is why we have this alerts here. And I have the small change branch that I just created. I'm going to create a pull request for it. Yes, I'm okay with this message. Okay, so as you can see, Jenkins X is already doing some things on this PR. The moment I created, the bot user posted a message telling me that basically this PR is not approved. And if we look at the list of pipelines, we should notice that there is a new pipeline running. And this pipeline is the one that is configured to run for the pull request. And what this is going to do actually is going to create another environment. So it's going to create another namespace in our cluster. And it's going to build an intermediary Docker image. And it's going to deploy it into a preview environment. So this is another feature of Jenkins X, that it's for every change you push into a pull request, it will create preview environments so you can immediately just see your changes and, well, you know, see if they are as you wish. Now this might take a little bit. And I can take the opportunity to actually show you where the pipelines are running. So as I mentioned, there is no Jenkins. Everything is running as Kubernetes resources. So what we could do is we can see this. So a pipeline has different tasks, and each task has different steps. And basically, every task is a pod, and every step is a container in that pod. So if we look at it here, currently this is where our pipeline is running in this pod here. It has 9 containers, so each of those containers is doing something different. And what we can see here is that there are other pods from the previous pipelines that we have run. And these pipelines, after they finish, then the status of the pod goes to completed, and they stick around here. And let's see how this is going. Oh, it's still running, still has a few things to do. Let's see, it shouldn't take long. As I mentioned, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to add them into the chat. I will try to answer them on the way. So this is another way to see the pipelines. I think there's a command called jxget pipelines. There we go. What I don't really understand, I guess something is not really working here, since they are not showing the status or the duration. So I'm not sure. I guess this is a bug. So there's a question, can we use Jenkins X with any other Kubernetes orchestrator like Rancher or Minikube? Support for Minikube has been deprecated. So that's basically how I started initially with Jenkins X. I tried to run it on Minikube, and well, you need to do some hacks on that, but it worked. Now they say that it's going to be deprecated, so I haven't tried it since. Theoretically, might work. I don't know. And then Jenkins X can run on whatever Kubernetes, let's say, deployment. As I can show you quickly here. Here. So if we look into the dev environment, we have kube providers here. And this is basically where you have settings for other providers. Now, if you don't have the provider here, you can always use the Kubernetes generic provider. So theoretically, it should work on multiple of them. I only tried it on Minikube, on Google Cloud, and EKS so far. Okay, I see a notification here. So I guess the pipeline has finished. Let's see. Yes, finished. So there's a new comment now. The bot notified me that the PR has been built in a preview environment, which is called like this. And I can actually preview it here. So there's a URL, and there you go. We can see the service, the application running with the changes that I made. So that's pretty cool. Now, another part of the GitOps thing is that basically I can approve and I can deploy this pull request using comments here in GitHub. So it actually informs me here that to fully approve this pull request, assign additional approvers, we suggest the following additional approver. And that is me. That is my user here that I'm logged in with. So what I can do, I can just go here and, well, let's say I verified and I'm satisfied with the change, which I am, I think it looks great. Then I can just go here and say something like approve and add a comment. And hopefully something is going to happen now. Let's see. It would be pretty funny if this doesn't work now. Let's see. Yeah, it sometimes takes a little bit of time for the Jenkins X component inside of the cluster to notice the changes. So there is this is what Tide is. Tide is I can show you here. It's a pod which is running inside of the Jenkins X JX namespace. So you can see it here. And this component is watching for all the events on PRs. And then it decides when it should do something on the PRs. It doesn't seem to be doing anything. Oh, I'm disappointed. Why isn't it doing? Okay, let's see. Let me try something else. There's another. Oh, okay. Weird. So, well, another word you can use in order to command or word, whatever, to approve a PR is using LGTM, which comes from looks good to me. Yeah, there's a bit of, theoretically, I should not be able to add looks good to me on my own PR, but in this case, it worked. There are all kinds of instructions here. Well, what I'm doing here is not very natural because I'm the same user who has created the PR and I'm approving it myself. I put myself on the list of approvers. normally in a team, you wouldn't really do that. You would have multiple users that you would use to approve PRs. But anyway, but the moment the PR has been approved, you can already see that has been already merged. And if I check, there should be a few pipelines. Oh, actually, just one. So since I merged this to master, the pipeline running on the master branch for Cool React has started, and this will basically create yet another Docker image and push it to the repository, and then it will also promote it to staging automatically, which is going to be another pipeline that should start soon. Yeah. Let's see if there's anything I missed to say. Yeah, question, when are preview environments deleted? As far as I know, there's some sort of garbage collection in the cluster, maybe every 4 hours, I'm not sure. I've never waited enough to to see that running. But I read at some point that there is some sort of mechanism to clear this out. Otherwise, you can just do it manually. So we should see here another namespace. There you go. So this is the namespace where the preview version is running. And if we look inside, we can see, let's see. By the way, I have an alias for kubectl for K because it's faster to type. So K or kubectl is the same. Let's see, JX Jenkins. There you go. Yeah, so there's only one pod running here, which is the one from the preview. Let's see. Oh, there you go. So there's already, the promotion has started on the staging environment, and there is another way which you can see the steps, the stages that are happening right now. So you can say JX get activity, and this one is going to print a lot of things right now, but it's basically printing all the pipelines that are running or have run so far. And you can see here all the steps that they do. So currently, this is the pipeline running for staging, where they're promoting the new version of our service. And it looks like it's almost done. So this is another view which shows kind of the same information, maybe a bit more information than what is in here. And there's also, you can see logs as well. So you can do JX get build logs. And I think if you hit enter, it will ask you for which pipeline you want to see. So let's see. Maybe this one. So this is the one that it actually promotes the new version in staging. It has a lot of things in here. And you can see that this pipeline has been generated because it says here from build pack. So this is something that whenever Jenkins says detects a certain language in those service, then it just tries to guess some pipelines and some Docker files for the service. All right, there's another question. How does the promotion happen? It's reinstalling the Kubernetes definitions, or does an upgrade? Very good question. So it just finishes. Let me see. I haven't thought about it that much. So one of the things that it does is that it's creating a new, I would assume that it updates the deployments and the replica set with the new version of the, it's using Helm, by the way. So it's using Helm to deploy all this stuff. So I assume since it publishes a new image, it creates a Helm chart, which is deployed somewhere in the cluster. There's a Helm chart museum. And then the pipeline for each environment is picking up that there's a new version that needs to be deployed of each service, which is registered for each environment. And it's just, I guess it just runs the Helm charts that deploys the new version. All right, so let's see. Pipelines should be done. Okay, cool. So right now what we have is that we have a new version deployed into staging. So we created a change and we approved it and has been deployed to staging. Now the next step would be, let's say we spend some time in staging, we do whatever we need to do there, and then we say, hey, it's ready to deploy to production. So the next step would be is to promote this to production. As I mentioned, promotion to production is not automatic, only to staging. So in order to deploy the new version into production, we need to run a command, which is interesting, which is JX promote. And then we specify the version we want to deploy and to what environment. I don't have to specify the service because I'm inside of the repo and it knows to take it from there. So if I run this, yes, 1 second, I will show you the staging URL in a bit. Are you sure you want to promote the application named Core React? Yes. Okay, now it just keeps on going. So the stage URL, no, this is the PR. Okay. I can't see the tabs because of Zoom. Yes, this is the one. So I hope you can see it in my browser. Yeah, this is currently running here with the latest version, 0.02. Yes, it's also in the PR. Very good. Yeah, now I can show you after this finishes. I will be able to show you in using the JX get applications command. It will show again where, like, what versions are deployed into what environments. So obviously, come on, Zoom, let me. There are some other pipelines running here. And actually the pipeline for production is running now. So if I look at the, what we have done so far, I'll just want to show you here quickly until that is done. So the moment we have created a small change and we previewed it, there was a branch created a pull request and the pipeline basically started and deployed it to the preview environment. So that is pretty simple. And there's a snapshot. So this is basically, if I would open now ECR, you would see there would be a 0.0.0 snapshot PR1-1 version in ECR. And that is being used by the preview. Then the next step, I approved the change, and that triggered a bunch of pipelines. Well, actually, the first one was that the pull request has been merged into master of the project, and that triggered the pipeline number 1. And then when that happened, also it promoted the new version to staging, which, well, is done through a pull request and triggered 2 more pipelines. And like production is very similar like that. First, a pull request is being created inside of the repo. And then, well, that is being merged to master and deployed. There's also a new version here, 0.0.2, that has been created, I think, in the previous step. Yes, by the first pipeline here. I forgot to mention that it created the version 0.0.2. Yeah, and finally, after these pipelines are finished, we will have the new version in production. So let me exit presentation and let's see if it's finished. There you go. So now if I run, oh, there's another question here. Do you usually use, okay, so it's asking me if I want to use the same bot user as the username to comment on issues, and yes, go ahead. Okay, so if I run jxget applications now, it will tell me, and it will show me the URLs for staging and production and what version is running in there. And if I look at the namespaces, there is a new JX production namespace that has been created 3 minutes ago. And sure enough, if I will open this URL in my browser, should be able to see them. There you go. So this is the version that we just implemented. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, then I will go back to my presentation. So that was basically the demo, the live demo part.